Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're examining Top Girls by Caryl Churchill, considering the plot, context, themes and of course the dramatic methods that make it so epic and pinnacle. Before I go any further, I'd love for you to like this video, comment down below your thoughts on the text, alongside, why not, hit subscribe, join our tribe for all things English, literary and grammatical. So let's consider a few of the key highlights on Caryl Churchill and how her life may have shaped this body of work. She was born in 1938 and studied at Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, which was at the time a female college. She wrote radio plays whilst juggling motherhood alongside raising her 3 children. In 1974, she became a resident dramatist at the incredibly prestigious and extremely experimental The Royal Court, which must have spurred her ideas on further. Now, in 1979, her play Cloud 9 received great international acclaim and definitely put her name in lights. But as ever, across her body of work, Churchill is interested, in fact fascinated, by hyperrealism, or what some may call surrealism, to explore issues of class, gender, political corruption and how humans communicate. This play, Top Girls, first written and performed in 1982 and set in 1980, must have risen to her atop of her agenda upon the rise of Thatcher. Max Stafford Clark, who was director of each of the first 3 core productions of this, both in 1982, 1991 and 2011, cites this repeatedly, and I'll come back to that later in this analysis. The National Theatre, just in 2019, again put this performance on, suggesting that this huge play has deep significance years on from Thatcher. And the idea of commenting on women was certainly something that mattered then and still has huge significance to us to reflect on now. Significantly for Churchill, in 2010, she was added to the American Theatre Hall of Fame for her contribution to playwriting, and in specific terms, for her contribution as a female voice to the theatre world. Now let's consider the women that Marlene chooses to invite to celebrate her promotion. I want us to consider the promptings that Churchill might have wanted us as an audience to have, and why Marlene might want these women with her. First up is Pope Joan, who disguised herself as a man from a young age in order to reach her own academic success and hopes and dreams. It's thought that she was Pope between 854 to 856, and in that time she was pregnant and famously gave birth, as we're told in the play, en route to a religious ceremony. She is stoned and killed. And across the play, where women are regularly talking over each other, her story evokes great silence. Perhaps it's ironic that Pope Joan reaches the dizziest heights as a man of great stature and have had to make it as a man to be successful. Is there a parallel there between how Marlene sees herself in her own workplace? Next up is the subject of a Bruegel painting, Dulgrete. She's a woman in an apron and armour, leading a crowd of women charging through hell and fighting devils. She might seem on surface value in the play a comic character, but she's got a serious story to tell. And her armour may well be the armour of having to do battle in life within hell. Next up we have Lady Nijo. She's Japanese and born in 1258. She was an emperor's courtesan and later a Buddhist nun who travelled on foot through Japan. When she hears of others and their stories of having children, we recognise that for each of the babies she bore, they were removed from her at birth, and she lost them all. We learn of her sadness and can understand why she chose the life of a Buddhist nun after so much abuse at the hands of men and their needs. And then we meet patient Griselda. She's the last guest to join us. Griselda's story is popular as it demonstrates that of the obedient wife, and it's popular as it's told by many writers, including Chaucer in The Clerk's Wife, and also by Petrarch. She lives a life of self-denial to the extreme. Her role as mother is seen as secondary to her life as spouse, and the sacrifices she's prepared to take are allegedly rewarded in the story, but arguably are not in reality. The story, I should clarify, is called The Clerk's Tale from the Canterbury Tales. In my mind, it's always the clerk's wife because it's interesting how she is depicted. Each of these women have children, and they suffer. Yet this woman, who's the first on the scene for the dinner party, does not have children. This is Isabella Bird, a phenomenal, extensive traveller across her lifetime, who recorded her experiences and between 1831 and 1904 lived a life of much indulgence. It's significant that across this play, as the cast is all women, these same actors are repurposed elsewhere. So it's interesting that Isabella's major relationship that she reflects on positively is that with her sister and her desire to care for her sister, and how her sister doesn't belong where she did in Hawaii when she went. She instead belonged in Scotland. It's interesting that the actress who plays Isabella Bird will later reprise the role as Joyce, Marlene's sister. It's these details of how this works as a play that are fascinating. But we mustn't ignore the term herstory, first coined by scholar Robin Morgan in her 1970 anthology, Sisterhood is Powerful. Churchill here is reclaiming the voices of women that, frankly, we've forgotten all too easily. She signals her affinity for us as audience members to engage with their history. In particular, I think it's significant that Marlene invites these women. She rejects the ties of blood relationships and actually chooses for this to be the backdrop. These notable women. Surely if this was about notable women of history, we might expect to hear from Cleopatra, from Queen Elizabeth, from Victoria. Instead, these women are at the front. I'd love for you to consider now, which women would you invite from history if you were hosting a party like this? So let's begin with this whistle-stop tour of the plot. Marlene hosts a dinner party to celebrate her promotion at the Top Girls agency. Her guests are women from myth, history and art. I think it's significant that this isn't a party with friends or family. As the dinner party unfolds, these women get drunk and they share their often troubled and troubling lives. They exchange stories of motherhood, abuse, disappointment and loss. It locks them all together. These are interesting figures for Marlene to want to share her success with. In Act 2, we see Marlene back in her workplace, encouraging a client, Janine, not to share her plans of marriage, children with her future employer. Instead, she suggests that Janine concentrates on putting her best self forward, showing she's really keen to be in the workplace. There's a sense that Marlene is judging Janine's choices by seeking to get married and potentially having a family. We also see Angie and Kit in a garden, making plans to see a film in town, and we see a grotesque scene of Kit licking her own period stain in front of Angie to show she's not scared of blood. Angie also speaks of her desire to kill her mother Joyce, who is Marlene's sister. Back in the Top Girl offices, we learn from other female employees, Wynne and Nell, how Marlene deserved the top job over another colleague called Howard. By Act 3, we are taken a year back in time to Joyce's kitchen, where she and Marlene are talking. It's uncovered that Joyce didn't expect Marlene and that Marlene believed that she was invited because Angie rang to confirm that Joyce wanted to see her. Across this act, it's revealed to us that Marlene is the mother of Angie. She abandoned her when she was young, and Joyce, 3 years into being married and still not bearing a child, decided to take her on. Joyce, we learn, miscarried a child, and In some respects, that juggle around motherhood is fascinating. We learn that Marlene doesn't regularly contribute to Angie's cost of living. And more than anything, we see the true divide in political terms between these two sisters. Marlene proclaims she doesn't believe in class anymore, and Joyce accuses her of being one of them. The final moments of the play are Angie waking up, obviously still not knowing who her real mother is, asking for her mum, and just repeating one word solemnly: frightening. There's a lot at stake in the way this plot is designed, and it's focusing on surrealism at points in the way it operates. But as we get into this analysis, we're first unlocking the context, then seeing how it fits into some of the themes and the dramatic methods on offer. Let's get into it. No analysis of Top Girls could be without considering the rise of Margaret Thatcher. She's the first female Prime Minister, and she's in office from 1979 to 1990, but she's also haunting this play. It's significant that this is the play Churchill chooses to write in 1982, and she sets it in 1980. By doing so, she's putting to the forefront her concerns. This definitely feels like a socialist feminist play at points, but it's not to say that that is the only reason why Churchill may have put these ideas into her play. Thatcher was a divisive figure for many reasons. She famously didn't promote any women in her own government, aside from Baroness Young, who she briefly made leader of the House of Lords. And actually, for feminists across the country, this was quite a devastating devaluing of their work, as she did so little to advance the position of other women, either within the political sphere itself or the society at large. She was a divisive figure for many reasons, not just this, largely because she favoured individualism and the idea of meritocracy, the belief that you should be able to get where you want to because you've worked hard. That's a lovely ideal, but in reality this sentiment divided Britain. Marlene mirrors Thatcher exactly when she says, "I don't believe in class. Anyone can do anything if they've got what it takes." When she says this to her sister in Act 3, we recognise that is absolutely not how Joyce sees it. In real terms, Thatcher did boost capital in Britain, but she divided the gap between rich and poor. She increased homelessness and unemployment, especially in the north of England and in rural areas. There was a sense in which some were the haves and some were the have-nots. To some extent, perhaps we're still there today. Act 3 is such a significant melting pot of the rise of Thatcher being shown in all its glorious division. We've got Marlene and Joyce sharing both sides of the argument, with Marlene clinging on to the words of Thatcher and believing it's the most exciting time ever. And potentially it is. She is an example of a bourgeoisie feminist, you could say, who believes that her success comes from her matching men. And instead, Joyce sees it as suffering, that her sister has become one of them. Thatcher is still divisive to this day. I'd urge some of you to look up the announcement of her death, and some people were having street parties, other people were mourning her loss. The rise of Thatcher perhaps may correlate with the idea that this play lives on. Its message speaks into the concerns that people have about division in general. We've got to consider that actually women's liberation is at the heart of 1960s and 1970s consciousness, not necessarily because everyone agrees with it, but because the second generation of feminists, and their second wave rather, is concentrating on personal politics, emphasising the examination of women's roles in both the domestic sphere and the world of work, the idea of contraception and abortion, the notion that there should be contraception, the notion that women are in charge of their body, not somebody else, the idea that sexual and domestic abuse is wrong and should be made illegal, all comes to the fore. Law changes that echo that resonate deeply across the play. Whether that's the Abortion Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act, I think that Churchill is making incredibly brazen political statements that flag the limits and discussions as they currently stand. about where women should be. It's interesting that the employment agency that Marlene runs is called Top Girls. We're not really sure if everyone gets the irony. Churchill was certainly worried that the irony would be lost on many a reader of her title. But the context of women's liberation is very much the case that by the end of the play we see the shackles for each woman in the choices they make or have taken. There's no denying that what I've already referenced as a quite bourgeoisie feminist attitude from Marlene about behaving as a man in a man's world is far from liberation. And the fact that the opening scene is a celebration of her promotion is interesting in that to what extent we feel like we should be celebrating with her is part of our critique of the play. How can we celebrate women's success? What does it look like? Churchill is asking the question, what does it look like for a woman to truly be free? In fact, Joyce has to pick up the slack for Marlene abandoning her role as a mother. It's interesting as a very superficial reference point that Max Stafford Clark recognises that some of the initial questions he was asked as director about this text was how hard was it for you working with all women in the cast? And to him, it smacked that women's liberation was far away if some of the male critics were asking that calibre of question. We got to contextualise this play into 1982 and consider why Churchill chooses to write it just 2 years prior and why in 2019 it still has merit for people to perform at the National Theatre. Motherhood is a restless theme that resonates across the play. The opening scene situates the troubling discussion of women. All who are mothers in that conversation are weaker and oppressed because of having children. Pope Joan is stoned when her child is born. Nijo has every child born of her lovers removed. Gret's lost children in war. Griselda has to give up children on her husband's quite strange and obscure whims. And then we have to recognise that in each phase of the play, we're introduced to another woman who experiences the struggles ahead of them if they are to declare to a future employer that they might want children one day. When Marlene is advising in Act 2, Janine, who talks about potentially getting married and having a family, Marlene is quite judgmental and clear that she needs to avoid referencing any desire for that to a future employer. Significantly above any other character, the admission that we learn in Act 3 that Marlene is a mother who callously gave up her child definitely forces us to question her, and significantly how individualistic her desires are to be the woman who has it all. She must avoid taking on the role of mother. Joyce, however, her sister, acts in that sacrificial care and takes on the role of caring for Angie, even though we know in Act 2 that Angie seeks to kill her mother, Joyce, of course. When Joyce says, "I don't know how you could leave your own child," Marlene's response later in that conversation is, "You couldn't have one, so you took mine." I suppose the tension that Churchill is drawing out from each of those varied examples is the intricate struggle that a woman must have to navigate the world of motherhood in a way that doesn't discredit their voice in the workplace, and yet historically how women are oppressed because of the need to care for little people. In Joyce's case, we learn that she's not given the opportunity to look after her own children. She doesn't get that choice. And yes, she's not violently oppressed by being a mother, but she's not given an opportunity to enjoy it in all its glory. It's imposed upon her by a sister who, frankly, doesn't take much care for it herself. Marlene's lack of gratitude in her line that I just referenced echoes this sense in which it's your choice, you do it. Motherhood here is a burden, but in the case of Joyce, it's a burden that's imposed upon her that she must be grateful for her sister's negligence elsewhere. Marlene's rationale for leaving the child is that she didn't want to get married to some random dairyman. The crucial thing that Churchill embeds across this play is the idea that women must act as a sisterhood, but in some respects, that challenge on motherhood never can be gotten rid of. It's a challenge for sure. Equally, the theme of sisterhood resonates across the play. From the slightly frivolous opening line of "We won't wait," as Marlene directs the waitress that the meal must begin, we also reflect more on her understanding of what sisterhood could be. It's not a throwaway comment. It's true that Marlene only sees it worth caring about other women when it matches her individual goals and success-orientated personality. Later in the play, we learn huge amounts about how neglectful she has been to her own sister and her own daughter. We learn from her colleague that she never talks about her family when Angie arrives at Top Girls. We also learn from the conversations between Marlene's employees that they feel she's filled up the room at the top, so they can't progress. There's an interesting challenge about what it is to be a good sister. It's definitely clear in Act 3 that Marlene is not a good sister, but it's equally interesting to reflect on it in other moments of the play that might not seem to so overtly comment on sisterhood. If we are to say that each woman should care for each other, well, there are moments in this play where we are shown some very sinister underplaying of the role of that care. When Marlene, in all seriousness, thinks she's doing the right thing by warding Janine off, talking about her goals of being a mother and a wife, we are understanding that to be a good woman is to mask those elements of oneself. Now, you could say that is a good act of sisterhood. But equally, when Louise is being advised by the Top Girls agency, and she's a woman in her 40s, she wards against this idea that the younger, more attractive women in their 30s, they, in some respects, take themselves for granted, she says. We understand there's a hostility between older women to younger women, and sisterhood between different generations is missing. There's a sense in which there are political issues between women that need addressing. And that resonates all the way back to the opening scene, where Isabella Bird dismisses some activity from people in East Asia. And she says it's barbaric behaviour. And Nijo says, well, we wouldn't understand. There's a sense in which Churchill is calling upon us to question and critique what would it look like for us to care for each other properly as individuals, as women, and how can womankind possibly change the landscape where the battles they're fighting are also not just being fought in the workplace and the home, but between each other. Whilst Marlene is never overtly malicious, she absolutely is tactical in ensuring that she is always the top girl. A fundamental feature of the play that makes it so iconic is the overlapping dialogue, people talking over each other. I love it because I think it mirrors how we interact in real life. Some of the interjections signal rudeness, whilst others lull us into a sense of calm or excitement. Sometimes we just see the natural end of a conversation. For example, the moment in Act 1 in the first scene where Joan tells her heart-rending story of how she's stoned and then the whole conversation shuts down, shows that that's the moment of true importance to all of the characters, and maybe focuses our attention to the dramatic struggle and failure. I love the critical gaze, and so I have a few voices here that share their own view on the production and the use of overlapping dialogue. Something I want to flag to you though is that actually if you are to do real justice to this play when you're watching it, do take into consideration which parts of the conversation and dialogue you choose to listen into when people are overlapping each other, because actually that speaks into something of our own passion as observers. It stops us from being passive. It's a clever device from Churchill. Philip Roberts, that is, talks of the layering and intercutting of what is said that produces precise the effect of a normal dinner party. And he's talking about that sense of realism and naturalism, actually, in the way that Churchill writes this. Yet Elaine Aston takes a totally different view. She believes it fuels the notion that women are self-centeredly caught up in their own individual narrative, and she dislikes that and thinks it's actually a good way of tarnishing women. I'd also urge you to read the play aloud so you can feel the tension in how the interruption works to fuel your own interpretation. So the structure of the play is unusual. It's ambiguous, it's non-chronological, and actually it divided critical reaction. Some were baffled by it, some were delighted by it. What I need you to recognise is that because it's out of order, some of the events as they happen really trigger us into thinking as audiences in one way. And then at other points in the play, we're forced to reconnect with other parts of the play. Let me put that into context for you. The opening scene is this mad fantasy of these women from history sat round the table with Marlene. But beyond that scene, we're also forced to see the same themes and parallels as we've uncovered draw out their full implication. Marlene is the only character that features in all three acts. And so there's another factor that's fascinating about how other characters push their ideas that link from other notions that we don't see. I think Act 2 is much more conventional. It's following the life of Angie in some respects. We learn at the end of that act from Marlene, Angie isn't going to make it. And actually, in real time, that's the most recent event for us as an audience, because Act 3 takes us right back a year. And that's when we get all this unearthing of the conflict between Joyce and Marlene. I love the interruptions for the way they force us as audience members to think. And it's also important for us to recognise that Churchill wanted this in 3 acts. In reality, the performances that are put on in theatres are often done with an interval in the middle. And so due to those practicalities, her intended structure hasn't always run through as you might expect. In some productions I've seen, the first act is that first scene with the women from history, and then Act 2, if you like, is Angie's story. But it's so important that we engage with this. I think it's also important for us to get that, well, in some respects, we aren't meant to follow the structure in a really passive way. We're meant to be disrupted by it, much like the disruption is imposed on women in their lives through the stories that are unfolded. I think it's a really great way of pushing the message of interruption in more than just the speech of what people state.